The jungle was alive with sound, not the peaceful chorus of birds or the gentle rustle of leaves in a summer breeze, but something far more primal. Something that made the hair on the back of Private First Class Danny Morrison's neck stand on end as he crouched behind a rotting log somewhere in the central highlands of South Vietnam. It was March 1968, and the air hung thick with humidity, the kind that made a man's uniform stick to his skin like a second layer of flesh he never asked for. Danny was 19 years old. Back home in Cleveland, Ohio, his mother was probably sitting in the kitchen right now, stirring sugar into her morning coffee, wondering if her boy was safe. She would never know that at this exact moment, her son was gripping a weapon he had come to call the Pig with white-knuckled intensity, listening to the distant pop of gunfire echoing through the triple canopy forest, like thunder rolling across an endless green sea. The M60 machine gun weighed 23 pounds unloaded. With a belt of ammunition draped across his shoulders, Danny carried close to 40 pounds of steel and brass everywhere he went. His shoulders ached, his back screamed. But the Pig had become more than a burden. It had become his identity, his responsibility, his strange and terrible companion in this war that seemed to have no beginning and no end. He did not know it yet, but the nickname he used so casually, the name every machine gunner in Vietnam used for the M60, was part of something larger. It was part of a linguistic phenomenon that would define an entire generation of American soldiers. A secret language born in the mud and blood of Southeast Asia. A vocabulary of survival, dark humor, and psychological adaptation that transformed cold instruments of war into something almost human. The practice of naming weapons was not new to warfare. Soldiers throughout history had given names to their swords, their rifles, their artillery pieces. But what happened in Vietnam was different. It was not about individual soldiers naming individual weapons. It was about an entire military culture developing a shared lexicon, a common tongue that separated those who had been there from those who never would understand. The names were strange, they were funny, they were sometimes crude. But beneath the surface of each nickname lay a deeper truth about the men who created them and the war that shaped their language. Danny Morrison had learned the name Pig within his first week in country. His squad leader, a staff sergeant from rural Georgia named Thomas Becker, had handed him the M60 with something that might have been a smile on his weathered face. "This here's your pig now, boy," Becker had said, his accent thick as molasses. "You feed her, you clean her, you sleep with her. She gets hungry, you give her ammo. She gets dirty, you strip her down and wipe every piece. You treat her right, she'll keep you alive. You treat her wrong, she'll jam up on you when Charlie's coming through the wire, and that'll be the last mistake you ever make." Danny had nodded, not fully understanding. He was fresh from Fort Benning, where the drill sergeants had called the M60 by its official designation, or simply the 60. But here in Vietnam, official designations meant nothing. Here the weapons had personalities, they had appetites, they had names that told you everything you needed to know about what it meant to carry them. The Pig was called the Pig because it was heavy, awkward, and ate ammunition like a starving animal at a trough. A single M60 could burn through 100 rounds in less than a minute of sustained fire. The weapon devoured belted 7.62 ammunition with insatiable hunger, and the men who carried it became its servants, hauling not just the gun itself, but hundreds of rounds of linked brass that clinked and rattled with every step through the jungle. But there was more to the name than simple gluttony. The M60 was notoriously temperamental. It ran hot, it jammed. Its parts wore out with frustrating regularity. The feed tray cover would sometimes pop open in the middle of a firefight. The gas piston would foul with carbon buildup. The barrel would overheat and warp if a gunner was not disciplined about changing it during sustained engagements. In short, the pig required constant attention, constant care, constant feeding, like a farm animal that demanded everything from its keeper and gave back only what it chose to give. The name was perfect. It captured the relationship between man and machine in a way that no technical manual ever could. Danny had been carrying the pig for 3 months now. His shoulders had developed calluses where the carrying strap cut into his flesh. His hands had learned the weapon's every contour, every lever, every latch. He could field strip the M60 blindfolded, could reassemble it in the dark, while rain hammered down on his poncho and unseen things moved through the jungle around him. The weapon had become an extension of his body, and the name had become part of who he was. "Pig gunner up!" The call came from somewhere ahead, Sergeant Becker's voice cutting through the green twilight of the forest. Danny rose from behind his log. The pig balanced on his hip and moved forward to where his squad was gathering at the edge of a small clearing. The afternoon light filtered down through gaps in the canopy, creating shafts of gold that seemed almost holy in this unholy place. Danny took his position at the right flank, setting the pig's bipod against a fallen tree and scanning the tree line across the clearing. His assistant gunner, a skinny kid from New Mexico named Rodriguez, settled in beside him with 200 rounds of linked ammunition coiled in a canvas bag. "You think they're out there?" Rodriguez whispered, his voice barely audible above the buzz of insects. Danny did not answer. He was watching the shadows between the trees, looking for movement, looking for the telltale signs that every infantryman learned to recognize: the unnatural stillness that preceded an ambush, the flash of reflected light off a weapon barrel, the slight swaying of vegetation that indicated something larger than wind. The jungle revealed nothing. But Danny had learned that in Vietnam, the jungle always lied. Across the clearing, another squad was setting up a defensive position. Danny could see their pig gunner, a corporal named Whitfield, positioning his weapon to cover the left approach. 2 M60s could create overlapping fields of fire that would shred anything trying to cross that open ground. It was a standard tactic, one they had practiced a dozen times, but practice and reality were different things entirely. Danny's finger rested alongside the trigger guard, not on the trigger itself. That was another lesson Sergeant Becker had drilled into him during those first terrifying weeks. A nervous finger on the trigger could send a burst of fire into the backs of your own men. It could give away your position to an enemy who was listening for exactly that kind of mistake. It could waste precious ammunition that you might desperately need 30 seconds later. The pig demanded discipline. The pig demanded patience. The pig demanded that you become something more than a frightened teenager from Cleveland, who had never seen death before he stepped off that transport plane in Saigon. Minutes passed. The jungle remained silent. Then Sergeant Becker's hand signal came down the line, the gesture for "move out," and the squad rose as one organism and continued their patrol deeper into the green unknown. As Danny lifted the pig onto his shoulder and fell into formation, he thought about the other nicknames he had learned since arriving in country. The M16 rifle that most of his squadmates carried was called the Mattel Toy, or simply the Plastic Fantastic, a mocking reference to its lightweight polymer construction that made old-school soldiers distrust it immediately. The M79 grenade launcher was the Thumper, or the Blooper, names that captured the distinctive sound it made when firing a 40mm high-explosive round into the undergrowth. The M1911 pistol that officers carried was the Hogleg, or simply the 45, a holdover from an earlier generation of warfare. Each name told a story. Each name carried weight and meaning and history. And together, they formed a vocabulary that bound these young men together in ways that their training never had. Danny did not know it yet, but he was living through the creation of a linguistic tradition that would outlast the war itself. The nicknames would survive. They would be passed down to future generations of soldiers. They would appear in movies and books and documentaries, becoming part of the American cultural memory of Vietnam. But for Danny Morrison, in that moment, there was no cultural memory. There was no historical perspective. There was only the weight of the pig on his shoulder, the sound of boots crunching through dead leaves, and the ever-present awareness that somewhere in the shadows, men with weapons of their own were waiting. The language of war was not written in dictionaries or taught in classrooms. It was written in sweat and fear and the strange intimacy that develops between a soldier and the instrument that keeps him alive. It was spoken in whispers and shouts, in jokes and curses, in the quiet moments before battle and the chaotic seconds during. Danny Morrison was learning to speak that language fluently, and the pig was his teacher. The patrol continued through the afternoon, moving deeper into terrain that maps called the Central Highlands, but soldiers simply called Indian country. The term was another piece of the Vietnam vocabulary, borrowed from an earlier chapter of American history and applied to any territory where the enemy held the advantage. Indian country was where the rules of conventional warfare dissolved, where every shadow could hide a sniper, where every trail could conceal a booby trap designed to maim and terrify. The pig grew heavier with each passing hour. Danny's shoulders burned, his legs ached, but he did not complain. Pig gunners never complained. They understood that their burden was the price of the firepower they provided, the devastating capability that could mean the difference between life and death when the shooting started. As the sun began its descent toward the western ridgeline, Sergeant Becker called a halt at a small stream crossing. The squad spread out in a defensive perimeter while men refilled canteens and took brief moments of rest. Danny found a spot where he could set the pig down without letting it touch the muddy ground, propping the barrel against a rock and keeping the receiver elevated. Rodriguez handed him a canteen. "Pig looks thirsty too," the assistant gunner said with a tired grin. Danny smiled despite his exhaustion. "She's always thirsty, just like me." It was a small joke, barely worth the breath it took to speak. But in the jungle, small jokes mattered. They reminded you that you were still human, still capable of laughter, still connected to a world where people smiled and told jokes and lived lives that were not defined by fear. The pig gleamed dully in the fading light, its black metal surface marked by scratches and wear that told the story of its service. Danny ran his hand along the receiver, feeling the warmth that still radiated from the barrel shroud. The weapon was alive in its own way, a living thing that breathed fire and spoke in thunderous bursts. He understood now why soldiers named their weapons. It was not superstition, it was not foolishness. It was a way of acknowledging the profound relationship that existed between a man and the tool that kept him alive. The pig was not just a machine gun. It was a partner, a companion, a demanding and temperamental presence that required everything Danny had to give. And in return, the pig promised something that nothing else in Vietnam could promise: the power to fight back, the ability to make the enemy fear you as much as you feared him, the terrible certainty that when the shooting started, you would not be helpless. That promise was worth everything. It was worth the weight, the burden, the aching muscles and calloused skin. It was worth the strange nickname and the even stranger bond it represented. As the squad prepared to move out again, Danny Morrison lifted the pig onto his shoulder and felt something that might have been affection for the heavy weapon. In a war that made no sense, in a jungle that wanted to kill him, the pig was the one thing he could count on. He would carry that weight as far as he needed to carry it. And he would call it by the name that every machine gunner in Vietnam knew, the name that captured everything about what it meant to serve this demanding, devouring, essential instrument of war. The pig, heavy as sin, hungry as death, and absolutely, undeniably his. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. Every week we bring you stories like this one, untold histories of the men who fought and the language they created to survive. Subscribe now so you never miss a single chapter of these remarkable accounts. Specialist 4th Class Marcus Webb had never been much of a talker back home in Detroit. He was the kind of man who preferred to let his actions speak, who believed that words were cheap and deeds were what mattered. But in Vietnam, he discovered that words had power he never imagined. They could make a terrifying weapon seem almost friendly. They could transform the mathematics of death into something that sounded like a children's game. The M79 grenade launcher rested in his hands as he walked point for his squad through the Mekong Delta's endless maze of rice paddies and tree lines. The weapon was 30 inches long, weighed about 6 pounds loaded, and looked like nothing so much as an oversized sawed-off shotgun from some old Western movie. Its wooden stock was worn smooth by countless hands. Its single barrel, rifled to stabilize the spinning 40mm grenades it fired, gleamed with a light coating of oil that Marcus applied religiously every evening. The men in Marcus's unit called it the Blooper, or sometimes the Thumper. The names were onomatopoeia, words that sounded like the thing they described. When Marcus pulled the trigger, the weapon produced a distinctive thump as the propellant charge sent the grenade arcing toward its target. And when the grenade landed, it made a bloop sound just before detonating, a split-second warning that experienced soldiers learned to recognize and fear. Thump, bloop, boom. The sequence was burned into Marcus's memory like a brand. He had heard it hundreds of times now, sometimes from his own weapon, sometimes from the enemy grenadiers who had captured American M79s or received Chinese copies from their North Vietnamese suppliers. The sound was distinctive, unmistakable, unforgettable. The Blooper was a specialist weapon, and Marcus was a specialist in its use. He had been selected for the role during his second month in country, after his company commander noticed his unusual accuracy with the M79 during a training exercise. Most soldiers found the grenade launcher difficult to master. Its trajectory was high and arcing, requiring the shooter to compensate for distance, wind, and elevation in ways that felt deeply counterintuitive to anyone trained on conventional rifles. But Marcus had a gift. He could judge distances with uncanny precision, could calculate the necessary angle of his shot in the time it took to raise the weapon to his shoulder. His squad mates joked that he had a computer in his head, some kind of mechanical calculator that turned the art of grenade launching into pure science. Marcus never told them the truth. The truth was that his accuracy came from the same place as his silence, a childhood spent on the streets of Detroit, where survival depended on reading situations instantly and reacting without hesitation. He had learned to gauge distances by eye because running from trouble required knowing exactly how far you had to go. He had learned to calculate trajectories because throwing rocks at rival gang members taught you angles and arcs better than any physics class ever could. The skills that had kept him alive in Detroit were keeping him alive in Vietnam. The Blooper was simply an extension of those skills, a more lethal version of the rocks he had thrown as a teenager. The rice paddy ahead shimmered in the morning heat, its surface broken by the geometric patterns of planting and irrigation that Vietnamese farmers had perfected over centuries. Somewhere beyond the next tree line, Marcus knew, there might be enemy soldiers waiting. The Viet Cong loved the Delta, loved its waterways and its hiding places, and its vast network of tunnels that American soldiers could never fully map or destroy. Marcus scanned the terrain with practiced eyes. The Blooper was ready in his hands, a high-explosive dual-purpose round chambered and waiting. The HEDP round was his weapon of choice for most situations. It could kill enemy soldiers. It could destroy bunkers. It could turn a tree into a spray of wooden shrapnel that was almost as dangerous as the grenade itself. But the M79 could fire other rounds too, and Marcus had learned to appreciate each one for its particular purpose. The buckshot round turned the blooper into a giant shotgun, spraying 18 hardened pellets in a pattern that could shred a human body at close range. The illumination round could light up a nighttime battlefield with harsh white brilliance, exposing enemy movements and creating shadows that danced like demons. The smoke round could mark targets for airstrikes or provide cover for a squad's movement across open ground. The CS gas round could flush enemy soldiers from bunkers and tunnels, forcing them to choose between choking and fighting. Each round had its use, each round had its moment. And Marcus Webb knew them all. "Blooper man, you see anything?" The whispered question came from Corporal Jefferson, the squad leader, who had moved up to join Marcus at the point. Marcus shook his head slowly, never taking his eyes off the tree line. "Too quiet," he said. "Don't like it." Jefferson nodded. He was a veteran of 2 tours, a man who had learned to trust the instincts of his point men. If Webb said something was wrong, something was probably wrong. "Let's hold here. Get the pig up front." "Do." The hand signals went back along the column of soldiers strung out through the rice paddy. Within minutes, the M60 gunner was moving forward, his heavy weapon cradled across his arms like a sleeping child. The pig and the blooper working together was a combination that could solve most problems in Vietnam. The grenade launcher could reach out and touch targets that were too far for effective rifle fire. The machine gun could pin down enemy soldiers while the grenades found their marks. Marcus waited, patient as stone, while the squad repositioned around him. His finger rested alongside the blooper's trigger guard, ready but not committed. Like all good grenadiers, he had learned that the M79 was a weapon that demanded careful shot selection. Each round he fired was a round he could not get back. Each miss was a waste of precious ordnance that had to be carried through jungle and swamp at the cost of sweat and exhaustion. The thumper did not forgive careless shooters. The thumper required precision, patience, and the kind of cold-blooded calculation that most people never developed. The tree line remained silent. Too silent. The birds that should have been singing were quiet. The insects that should have been buzzing were still. Nature itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the pre-combat tension that never went away no matter how many firefights you survived. His senses sharpened, colors became more vivid, sounds became more distinct. Time itself seemed to slow down, stretching each second into a small eternity of awareness. Then he saw it, a flicker of movement in the shadows beneath the trees, a shape that was too regular to be natural, too deliberate to be accidental. "Contact front," Marcus breathed, his voice barely audible. 40 meters tree line, just left of the big palm. Jefferson's hand came down on his shoulder, acknowledging the sighting. The squad froze in place, weapons coming up to the ready position, eyes straining to see what Marcus had seen. For a long moment, nothing moved. The shape in the shadows could have been anything. A trick of light, a pile of debris, a farmer who had wandered into the wrong place at the wrong time. Then the tree line erupted. The first burst of automatic fire came from directly ahead, green traces snapping over the heads of the American soldiers and kicking up geysers of muddy water in the rice paddy. More fire came from the left flank, catching the squad in a classic L-shaped ambush that had been perfected by the Viet Cong over years of fighting. Marcus reacted without thinking. The blooper came up to his shoulder. His eye found the point where the muzzle flashes were brightest. His finger squeezed the trigger. Thump! The recoil was mild, almost gentle compared to a rifle. The grenade arced through the air on its 40-meter journey, spinning silently toward the target. Marcus was already breaking open the breach, already reaching for another round before the first one landed. Bloop! Boom! The explosion was sharp and final, a crack of noise that seemed too small for the destruction it caused. But Marcus knew that the HEDP round had just sent a spray of fragmentation and shape charge energy into whoever had been firing from that position. The pig opened up beside him, its deeper, steadier voice drowning out the lighter chatter of the enemy's weapons. Corporal Jefferson was shouting orders, directing fire, trying to gain control of a situation that had spiraled from peaceful patrol to desperate firefight in the space of a heartbeat. Marcus fired again, and again, and again. Each shot was calculated, aimed, delivered with the precision that had made him legendary among the grenadiers of his battalion. The blooper sang its strange song, thumping and blooping and booming across the rice paddy, while men fought and bled and died in the mud of the Mekong Delta. The firefight lasted 7 minutes, 7 minutes of chaos and terror and desperate courage that felt like 7 hours. When it was over, when the enemy fire had finally stopped and the smoke began to clear, Marcus Webb was still standing in the same spot where he had first called contact. His hands were shaking. They always shook after a firefight, no matter how many times he had been through one. It was the adrenaline leaving his system, the body's way of telling him that the danger had passed. He looked down at the blooper in his hands. The weapon was warm from firing, its barrel giving off a faint smell of burnt propellant. 3 of the 7 rounds he had fired had found their targets. 3 enemy positions had been silenced by 40-millimeter grenades that had traveled across the distance between life and death on arcing trajectories that only Marcus could see. "Good shooting, blooper man." Jefferson's voice was hoarse, strained from shouting over the noise of battle. "You saved our ass out there." Marcus nodded but said nothing. Words were cheap. Deeds were what mattered. And the blooper had done its deed today, had spoken its thump-bloop-boom language loud and clear. As the squad began the grim work of checking casualties and preparing to move out, Marcus took a moment to reload his weapon. His hands moved automatically, performing the familiar ritual of extraction and insertion that had become second nature over months of combat. A fresh HEDP round slid into the breech. The barrel locked closed with a satisfying click. The blooper was ready again. The thumper was hungry for more. In the weeks that followed, Marcus would fire the blooper dozens more times. He would arc grenades into bunkers and spider holes and tree lines that concealed enemy soldiers. He would fire illumination rounds on moonless nights when the darkness seemed alive with threats. He would mark targets with smoke and flush fighters with gas, and occasionally, when the range was right and the situation was desperate, he would switch to buckshot and use the blooper like the oversized shotgun it resembled. Each time, the names made the weapon feel more manageable, more controllable. The blooper and the thumper were not terrifying instruments of death. They were tools with personalities, companions with quirks, friends with reliable habits and predictable behaviors that a soldier could count on when everything else became chaos. The nicknames were more than slang. They were survival mechanisms, psychological tools that helped young men cope with the impossible demands of combat. By giving weapons human characteristics, by treating them as partners rather than objects, soldiers like Marcus Webb found a way to carry the weight of what they were doing. The blooper did not kill people. The blooper solved problems. The thumper did not destroy lives. The thumper spoke a language that the enemy understood. It was a small distinction, perhaps meaningless to anyone who had never been there, but to Marcus Webb and thousands of soldiers like him, that distinction meant everything. The M16 rifle was supposed to be the future of warfare. Lightweight, accurate, capable of firing on full automatic, it represented everything that military planners believed a modern combat rifle should be. But when it arrived in Vietnam, the soldiers who had to carry it into battle gave it names that dripped with contempt and dark humor. The Mattel toy, the Plastic Fantastic, the Jamming Jenny, Black Rifle, Widowmaker. Each name told a story of frustration, distrust, and the dangerous gap between what weapons designers promised and what combat soldiers experienced. Private First Class Robert Chen had grown up in San Francisco. the son of Chinese immigrants who had worked their entire lives to give him opportunities they never had. He had been drafted in 1967, pulled out of his sophomore year at Berkeley, and shipped halfway around the world to fight in a war he did not understand, against an enemy he had never seen. The M16 they issued him at the replacement depot felt wrong from the first moment he held it. After training with the heavier M14, the new rifle seemed almost weightless, more like a toy than a weapon of war. Its plastic furniture, designed to reduce weight and resist the humidity of tropical climates, gave it an artificial quality that inspired no confidence whatsoever. "This is what we're supposed to fight with?" Robert had asked his drill instructor, unable to hide his disbelief. The sergeant had just shrugged. "That's what Uncle Sam says. You don't like it, write your congressman." Robert did not write his congressman. Instead, he learned to live with the plastic fantastic, to work around its limitations, to curse it in private and depend on it in combat because there was simply no other choice. The early M16s that arrived in Vietnam were plagued with problems. The army had shipped them without cleaning kits, believing the manufacturer's claims that the rifle was self-cleaning. The ammunition issued was different from what the weapon had been designed for, causing excessive fouling and carbon buildup. The chrome-plated chambers that would later solve many of the jamming issues had not yet been implemented. The result was a disaster. Soldiers died with jammed rifles in their hands, their last moments spent desperately trying to clear malfunctions, while enemy bullets found their marks. The M16 became a symbol of everything wrong with how the war was being run. Decisions made by people in air-conditioned offices thousands of miles from the jungle, policies that looked good on paper but fell apart in the mud and rain of actual combat. Robert Chen learned to clean his rifle obsessively, 3 or 4 times a day when conditions allowed. He learned to oil it lightly, not heavily, because too much lubrication attracted the fine dust that turned to grinding paste inside the action. He learned to tap the forward assist with the heel of his palm before every patrol, ensuring that the bolt was fully seated and ready to fire. Most importantly, he learned never to trust the plastic fantastic completely. He always carried extra magazines, always kept his cleaning rod taped to the stock for emergency clearing, always positioned himself near a buddy whose weapon he could grab if his own betrayed him at the worst possible moment. "You know what Mattel's slogan is?" his squad mate Williams asked one evening as they sat cleaning their rifles by candlelight in a fire-base bunker. "You know the toy company?" Robert shook his head. "You can tell it's Mattel. It's swell." Williams held up his M16 with a bitter grin. "Swell, right? Real swell." The joke spread through the unit like wildfire. Within days, everyone was calling the M16 the Mattel toy, pronouncing the name with exaggerated cheerfulness that barely concealed the anger beneath. It was gallows humor of the darkest kind, a way of expressing rage at a system that had sent them to war with equipment that could not be trusted. But Robert also noticed something else happening as the nickname took hold. The soldiers who called their rifles the Mattel toy or the plastic fantastic seemed to handle the weapon's failures better than those who raged against it in silence. The names provided an outlet, a way of acknowledging the problem without being consumed by it. By giving the M16 a mocking nickname, soldiers transformed their relationship with the weapon. It was no longer a betrayal by their own military, no longer a life-threatening equipment failure. It was just the Mattel toy being the Mattel toy. What else would you expect from a plastic rifle designed by people who had never spent a day in combat? The nickname did not fix the jamming problems, it did not make the rifle more reliable, but it did something almost as important. It gave soldiers a way to cope with the fear and frustration of depending on equipment they could not trust. Robert Chen survived his tour in Vietnam. He went home to San Francisco, finished his degree at Berkeley, and eventually became an engineer specializing in quality control. He spent his career making sure that products worked as advertised, that the gap between promise and performance was as small as human effort could make it. He never forgot the plastic fantastic. He never forgot the lessons it taught him about the difference between design and reality, between intention and execution. And he never forgot the strange power of a nickname to transform fear into something manageable. If this story is resonating with you, leave a comment right now saying, "These names carried more weight than the weapons themselves." Let me know you understand what these soldiers went through and that their stories matter to you. The helicopters had their own language, their own vocabulary of nicknames that captured both their capabilities and their vulnerabilities. Soldiers who rode them, crewed them, and depended on them for survival developed an intimate relationship with these machines that transcended anything in the official military manuals. The UH-1 Iroquois was called the Huey, a nickname so universal that it eventually became the helicopter's official designation. But the soldiers knew other names too: Slick, Dustoff, Loach, Cobra. Each name carried meaning. Each name told you something about what the helicopter was and what it could do. Sergeant Michael Torres was a door gunner on a Huey Slick operating out of Kuchai. His aircraft was one of the transport helicopters that ferried troops into hot landing zones, delivered supplies to remote fire bases, and evacuated wounded soldiers under fire. The Slick earned its name because it was slick of external armament, carrying only the door guns manned by men like Torres, rather than the rocket pods and minigun systems mounted on the dedicated gunship variants. But Torres and his fellow door gunners had their own name for the weapon they operated. The M60D machine gun mounted on its pintle beside the cargo door was known simply as the Hog, or sometimes the Door Hog, distinguishing it from the infantry version that ground troops called the Pig. The distinction mattered. The Door Hog was modified for aerial use, with spade grips instead of a buttstock, a different feed system, and no bipod. It was designed to be swung across wide arcs of fire as the helicopter banked and maneuvered, laying down suppressive fire on landing zones or engaging enemy positions during strafing runs. Torres had flown 247 missions with the Door Hog. He had fired thousands of rounds from the open door of his Huey, watching the tracers arc down toward the jungle canopy like red ribbons unspooling in the wind. The weapon had become an extension of his body, responding to his hands with the familiarity of an old friend. But the helicopters themselves had the most evocative nicknames of all. The AH-1 Cobra gunship was called the Snake for obvious reasons. Its narrow profile and deadly armament, reminiscent of a predator coiled to strike. Cobra pilots developed a reputation for aggressive flying and precise weapons delivery, swooping down on enemy positions with rockets and minigun fire that could devastate an area the size of a football field in seconds. The OH-6 Cayenne, the small observation helicopter used for scouting and reconnaissance, was called the Loach, a corruption of its official designation as a light observation helicopter. Loach pilots flew low and slow over the jungle canopy, drawing enemy fire to reveal hidden positions, a job that required equal measures of skill and insanity. And the massive CH-47 Chinook, the twin-rotor transport helicopter that could carry artillery pieces, trucks, and entire platoons of soldiers, was called the Shithook by the troops who rode in its cavernous cargo bay. The name was crude but affectionate, acknowledging the helicopter's ungainly appearance while respecting its incredible capabilities. But of all the helicopter nicknames, none carried more emotional weight than Dustoff. Dustoff was the call sign for medical evacuation helicopters, the Hueys that flew into the hottest landing zones to retrieve wounded soldiers. The name had originated with Major Charles Kelly, a medevac pilot who had been killed while flying wounded soldiers out of a hot LZ in 1964. His last words, transmitted over the radio as enemy fire raked his aircraft, had become legend. When I have your wounded. After Kelly's death, Dustoff became the official call sign for all Army medevac helicopters in Vietnam. The name was spoken with reverence by infantry soldiers who knew that when they heard those rotor blades approaching, help was on the way. Dustoff pilots flew into situations that would make combat pilots hesitate, landing in the middle of firefights, hovering under enemy guns, doing whatever it took to reach wounded soldiers. Michael Torres had seen Dustoff helicopters in action dozens of times. He had watched them descend into landing zones that were still being swept by enemy fire, had seen medics leap out to retrieve casualties while bullets cracked past their heads. The Dustoff crews were a special breed, men and women who had chosen to fly into hell not to kill, but to save. The nicknames given to these helicopters and their weapons captured something essential about the Vietnam experience. They humanized the machinery of war, transformed cold metal and roaring engines into personalities that soldiers could relate to. The Snake was aggressive and deadly. The Loach was brave and crazy. The Dustoff was salvation wrapped in aluminum and kept aloft by faith. For Michael Torres, riding the Slick into combat with the Door Hog ready at his side, the nicknames were part of the rhythm of survival. They were words that meant you belonged, that you understood, that you had been there when it mattered. He would carry those words with him for the rest of his life, long after the sound of rotor blades faded from his daily existence. They would surface in dreams and memories, in conversations with fellow veterans who needed no explanation, in quiet moments when the past came rushing back unbidden. The language of Vietnam was a language of shared experience, and the helicopter nicknames were some of its most powerful vocabulary. As the war continued and casualties mounted, the psychological importance of weapon nicknames became increasingly clear to military researchers and medical officers. Studies conducted in field hospitals and psychiatric wards revealed that soldiers who developed strong personal relationships with their equipment showed greater resilience under combat stress. The nicknames were not just colorful slang. They were coping mechanisms, psychological tools that helped young men process the impossible demands of industrial warfare. Dr. Jonathan Hartley was a military psychiatrist assigned to the 93rd Evacuation Hospital at Long Binh. He spent 18 months treating soldiers suffering from combat fatigue, what a later generation would call post-traumatic stress disorder. In his clinical notes, later compiled into a groundbreaking study on combat psychology, he observed a consistent pattern. Soldiers who anthropomorphize their weapons, Hartley wrote, who give them names and attribute personalities to them, demonstrate measurably better psychological outcomes than those who maintain purely functional relationships with their equipment. The naming process appears to serve multiple therapeutic functions. It provides a sense of control in chaotic environments. It creates emotional distance between the soldier and the act of killing, and it establishes a form of companionship that partially compensates for the isolation of combat. The soldiers themselves would never have used such clinical language. They simply knew that calling the M60 the Pig made it easier to carry, that calling the M79 the Blooper made it easier to fire, that calling the M16 the Mattel Toy made it easier to cope with its failures. Corporal James Washington, a rifleman from Chicago who served 2 tours in Vietnam, described the phenomenon in more direct terms during a post-war interview. "You had to make friends with your weapon," he said. "Not in some crazy way, not like you were losing your mind. But you had to feel like it was on your side, like it wanted to keep you alive as much as you wanted to stay alive. The names helped with that. When I called my rifle my Sweet 16, it wasn't just words. It was like I was telling myself that this thing was part of my team, part of my squad. It wasn't just a tool, it was a buddy." The phenomenon extended beyond individual weapons to entire weapon systems and tactics. The practice of calling in artillery fire on enemy positions was known as bringing the rain or calling thunder. The devastating firepower of the B-52 bomber was called Arc Light, a name that captured the blinding flash of hundreds of bombs detonating across the jungle canopy. Napalm had its own vocabulary. The jellied gasoline that could turn acres of forest into inferno was called liquid fire, or simply NAPE. The tanks that delivered it were Zippos, named after the cigarette lighter. The pilots who flew napalm missions sometimes called their cargo crispy critters, a dark joke that acknowledged the horror of what they were delivering. These nicknames were not always comfortable, they were not always appropriate for polite company, but they served a vital function in helping soldiers maintain psychological equilibrium while engaging in acts that would have been unthinkable in civilian life. The naming continued after combat ended. Injuries had nicknames. A $1 million wound was an injury serious enough to get you sent home, but not serious enough to cripple you permanently. Locations had nicknames. The world was the United States, a place that seemed impossibly distant and peaceful. Even death had its nicknames. Buying the farm, getting greased, taking the long ride home. The language of Vietnam was a complete vocabulary for an experience that ordinary language could not capture. The nicknames were its nouns, its building blocks, its foundation. Without them, soldiers would have been forced to describe their experience in clinical terms that stripped away the humanity of what they were going through. With them, they could speak to each other in a shared tongue that acknowledged both the horror and the strange camaraderie of combat. They could make jokes about weapons that jammed and helicopters that crashed and enemies who would not stop coming. They could transform the machinery of death into something that felt, if not friendly, at least familiar. That familiarity saved lives. Not in the direct way that a weapon saves lives, by killing enemies before they can kill you, but in the indirect way that psychological resilience saves lives, by keeping soldiers functional and focused when everything around them was falling apart. The nicknames were survival tools, as real as any rifle or grenade, and the soldiers who used them knew their value, even if they could never have explained it in words that military psychiatrists would understand. The war ended, as all wars eventually do. The last American combat troops left Vietnam in 1973. The last helicopter lifted off from the embassy roof in Saigon in 1975. The soldiers who had fought and survived scattered back to their homes across America, carrying with them memories that would last a lifetime. They also carried the language. Danny Morrison, the machine gunner from Cleveland, who had carried the pig through the Central Highlands, came home to a country that did not want to hear about Vietnam. He took a job at a steel mill, got married, raised 2 children, and rarely spoke about his time in the war. But on certain nights, when sleep would not come and the memories pressed too close, he would find himself thinking in the old vocabulary. The pig, the blooper, the slick, the dust-off. The words had power even decades later. They could transport him back to the jungle in an instant, could make him feel the weight of the M60 on his shoulder, could make him hear the thump of helicopter rotors coming in low over the tree line. The language was a time machine, a portal to a past that refused to stay buried. Marcus Webb, the grenadier from Detroit who had mastered the blooper, became a police officer after the war. He served 30 years on the Detroit force, eventually rising to detective. His military training served him well on the streets, but he never talked about Vietnam with his fellow officers. The experience was too different, too removed from anything they could understand. Only at veteran reunions, surrounded by men who had been there, could Marcus speak freely in the language they shared. Those gatherings were like homecomings, moments when the vocabulary of Vietnam could flow without explanation or apology. The men would trade stories, laugh at old jokes, remember fallen friends with the nicknames they had used in life. "Remember Thompson and his thumper," someone would say, and everyone would remember. The names kept the dead alive, kept the experiences real, kept the bonds of combat from fading into the general blur of memory. Robert Chen, who had struggled with the Mattel toy, became an advocate for veterans' rights after his engineering career. He testified before Congress about equipment failures in Vietnam, about the gap between manufacturer promises and battlefield reality. His testimony helped drive reforms in military procurement that would benefit future generations of soldiers. But it was the nicknames that stayed with him most vividly: the Plastic Fantastic, the Jamming Jenny, the Widowmaker. Each name was a reminder of the lives lost to equipment that was not ready for combat, of young men who died with jammed rifles in their hands because someone in an air-conditioned office had decided that chrome-plated chambers were too expensive. The anger never fully faded, but the names helped him channel it, gave him words to describe what had happened and why it mattered. Michael Torres, the door gunner who had flown with the Slick and the Door Hog, suffered from what would later be diagnosed as PTSD. He struggled for years with nightmares, flashbacks, and the inability to feel comfortable in enclosed spaces. The sound of helicopter rotors could send him into a panic, could transport him instantly back to landing zones swept by enemy fire. But the nicknames also helped him heal. In therapy, in veteran support groups, in conversations with other door gunners who understood, the shared vocabulary provided a way to talk about experiences that were otherwise impossible to describe. The Slick, the Snake, the Dust-Off. The words were bridges between the unspeakable past and the necessary work of building a future. Decades after the war ended, the nicknames remained part of American military culture. New generations of soldiers learned to call the M240 machine gun the Pig in Iraq and Afghanistan, continuing a tradition that had begun in the jungles of Vietnam. The language evolved, adapted, grew, but its fundamental purpose remained unchanged. Weapons were given names because naming them made them manageable, because names created relationships between soldiers and their equipment, because the language of war required words that ordinary dictionaries could not provide. The soldiers who had created that language in Vietnam did not think of themselves as linguists or psychologists. They thought of themselves as men trying to survive, trying to make sense of chaos, trying to find some small measure of control in a situation that was fundamentally uncontrollable. The nicknames were their solution, and the nicknames endured. The practice of naming weapons did not begin in Vietnam, and it did not end there. Throughout human history, warriors have given names to the instruments of their trade, transforming cold metal into something that felt alive. Medieval knights named their swords. World War II bomber crews painted names and nose art on their aircraft. Civil War soldiers carved inscriptions into the stocks of their rifles. The impulse was universal, crossing cultures and centuries, but Vietnam was different. Vietnam was the first war where an entire military force developed a shared vocabulary of weapon nicknames that became standardized across units and regions. The Pig was the Pig, whether you were fighting in the Central Highlands or the Mekong Delta. The Blooper was the Blooper, whether you learned it in the Marines or the Army. This standardization was partly a product of the war's unique characteristics. The draft brought together young men from every corner of America, mixing them in ways that previous wars had not. The rotation system meant that soldiers were constantly arriving and departing, spreading language and culture across the entire theater of operations. The media coverage, unprecedented in its scope and immediacy, carried the vocabulary from Vietnam to American living rooms and back again. The nicknames became part of a larger cultural phenomenon. Movies like Apocalypse Now and Platoon used them authentically, introducing them to audiences who had never served. Books and memoirs repeated them, cementing their place in the historical record. Veterans told stories that included them, passing the language from one generation to the next. By the time the Vietnam Memorial was dedicated in Washington in 1982, the nicknames had become part of how America remembered the war. They were carved into the consciousness of a nation, words that evoked an entire era of sacrifice and controversy. For the men who had created and used that language, the memorial was a place where the nicknames found their final context. Standing before the black granite wall, reading the names of fallen friends, veterans could remember not just the men, but the weapons they had carried, the machines they had flown, the tools they had used to fight and survive. The pig, the blooper, the slick, the dust-off. Each weapon had its own roll of honor, its own list of soldiers who had carried it and died. The nicknames were memorials in their own right, verbal monuments to the experience of combat. And for those who had survived, the nicknames were connections to a past that could never be forgotten. They were passwords that identified fellow veterans, shibboleths that separated those who had been there from those who only thought they understood. The language of Vietnam remained alive because the men who spoke it remained alive. They carried it with them through decades of peace, through marriages and children and careers and retirement. They spoke it at reunions and funerals, in hospitals and homes, wherever veterans gathered to remember. And when they finally passed, they left the language behind as a legacy. Their children and grandchildren inherited not just memories but vocabulary, words that connected them to a history they could never fully understand but could always honor. The strange nicknames that U.S. soldiers gave their weapons in Vietnam were more than slang. They were artifacts of experience, fossils of a particular time and place preserved in language. They were proof that even in the midst of war's chaos and horror, human beings found ways to create meaning, to build connection, to transform the impersonal machinery of death into something that felt almost alive. That was the real story of the nicknames. Not the weapons themselves, but the men who named them. Not the metal and plastic and explosives, but the fear and courage and dark humor that shaped the words. The pig, the blooper, the Mattel toy, the slick, the dust-off, the snake, the thumper. Each name was a story, and together they told the story of a generation. The jungle is quiet now. The firebase where Danny Morrison once carried the pig has been reclaimed by vegetation, its bunkers collapsed and overgrown, its perimeter wire rusted to nothing. The rice paddies where Marcus Webb fired the blooper are cultivated by farmers who were not yet born when American helicopters filled the sky. Vietnam has moved on. America has moved on. The war that once consumed the attention of a generation has become history, studied in classrooms and depicted in films that cannot capture what it actually felt like to be there. But the nicknames remain. They appear in military training manuals, passed down from veteran instructors to new recruits. They surface in conversations between soldiers, words that connect different wars across decades of time. They live in the memories of men now growing old, men who remember when the pig was heavy on their shoulders and the blooper was warm in their hands. Danny Morrison died in 2019 at the age of 70. His son found him in his workshop, slumped over a workbench where he had been restoring an old motorcycle. On the wall above the bench hung a photograph from Vietnam, showing a young man with an M60 cradled across his arms, grinning despite the exhaustion visible in his eyes. At Danny's funeral, fellow veterans gathered to pay their respects. They told stories that included the old vocabulary, the old nicknames, the old language of a war that had shaped them forever. They laughed and cried and remembered, speaking in a tongue that their children could hear but never fully translate. Marcus Webb is still alive, 90 years old and living in a veterans' home in Michigan. His eyes are cloudy with cataracts, and his hands shake too badly to hold a weapon. But when visitors ask about Vietnam, his voice grows strong and clear, and the nicknames flow from his memory as if the war were yesterday. "The blooper saved my life a dozen times," he tells them. "That little thumping sound, that bloop before it hit, I can still hear it if I close my eyes." Robert Chen passed away in 2015, surrounded by his family. His last words were not about Vietnam, but about his grandchildren and the world they would inherit. Yet his wife later found a notebook in his desk, filled with careful handwriting that documented every nickname he could remember from his time in the war. The Mattel toy, the Plastic Fantastic, the Jamming Jenny, page after page of words and their meanings, a dictionary of a language that was slowly fading as its speakers departed. Michael Torres found peace in his final years. The nightmares faded. The flashbacks grew less frequent. He learned to hear helicopter rotors without panic, learned to live with memories instead of being consumed by them. When he died in 2021, his fellow door gunners gathered online to share memories, speaking in the vocabulary they had learned together above the jungles of Vietnam. The slick, the door hog, the snake, the dust-off. The words echoed across the internet, connecting men who were scattered across the country but united by experience. The strange nicknames that U.S. soldiers gave their weapons in Vietnam were never officially documented or preserved. They lived in oral tradition, passed from soldier to soldier, kept alive by repetition and memory. Some have been lost as the veterans who used them passed away. Others have evolved, changing slightly with each retelling. But the impulse that created them remains as powerful as ever. In every war, in every conflict, soldiers continue to name their weapons. They continue to transform machines into companions, to build relationships with the tools of their survival, to create language that captures what official terminology cannot express. It is a fundamentally human response to fundamentally inhuman circumstances, and it speaks to something deep in our nature, some need to find meaning and connection even in the midst of chaos and destruction. The soldiers who fought in Vietnam did not choose to be there. They were drafted or enlisted, trained and shipped overseas, thrust into a war that would mark them forever. But within that experience, they found ways to assert their humanity, to create culture, to build bonds that would outlast the war itself. The nicknames were part of that creation. They were small acts of linguistic rebellion, tiny assertions of personality and humor in a system designed to reduce men to interchangeable parts. They were proof that even in war, human beings remain stubbornly, irrepressibly human. The pig, the blooper, the Mattel toy, the slick, the dust-off. These names will eventually fade from living memory. The last veterans of Vietnam will pass, taking their first-hand knowledge with them. Future generations will learn the nicknames from books and documentaries, will understand them intellectually without feeling their emotional weight, but the legacy will remain. In military culture, in American history, in the ongoing human story of how we cope with war, the nicknames of Vietnam will endure as artifacts of a particular time and place. They will remind us that weapons are not just machines, that soldiers are not just statistics, that war is not just strategy and tactics, but a profoundly human experience that demands profoundly human responses. The jungles have grown back, the fire bases have crumbled, the helicopters have been decommissioned and scrapped, but the words remain, echoing across the decades, carrying the weight of everything they once meant. And in that echo, the soldiers who created them live on. If you watch this far, it's because this story moved you. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end," so I can get to know you and know who really appreciates the stories on this channel. If this video touched you, hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to hear these stories. The men who carried these weapons, who created these names, who fought and survived and remembered, they deserve to have their stories told. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel. Every week we bring you stories like this one, histories that deserve to be remembered, voices that deserve to be heard. Click subscribe and join us on this journey through the past.